I don't really get what the point of this movie is. It's like trying to create this iconic image of Bob Dylan, but it just makes him look like a total selfish prick.
Down the street, the dogs are barking, and the day is getting dark.
I watched A Complete Unknown directed by James Mangold. This movie tells the story of Bob Dylan's meteoric rise to fame in the early to mid 60s. It covers pretty pivotal moment in Bob Dylan's career. It's kind of like the origin of Bob Dylan in pop culture. And it traces a few different eras of his artistic development in the span of those 5, 6 years from 1960 to 65, 66. It stars Timmy Chalamet as the titular Bob Dylan, Timothée Chalamet, and Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez, Edward Norton as Pete Seeger, and Elle Fanning as a fictionalized version of Susie Rotolo. The movie has a plot that sort of seems to build up and culminate with Bob Dylan going electric. Originally, this movie was going to be called Going Electric. I gotta be honest, I really, really wanted to love this movie. I was not particularly excited about it just because James Mangold as a director, when I heard about that, I was a bit skeptical, and I avoided any trailers or any thing about the movie as much as I could. Although I did hear some things that I thought were a bit funny and made me even more skeptical. But still, I really wanted to love this movie. It's a movie that deals with my favorite musician of all time, basically. One of the greatest living artists in the United States. So influential, such a charismatic and unique figure, Bob Dylan. And yeah, I was ready to love this movie. I have a lot of problems with it, but I'm going to start with the positives that I felt this movie has. The performances by the actors, I thought, for the most part, were great. Timothée Chalamet does a very good Bob Dylan um, impression, I would say. He does really good with the material, although I have issues with the material and the direction itself. But I feel like Timothée Chalamet's work portraying Bob Dylan was actually pretty good, especially in the second half. I felt like that's where he really nailed some of Bob Dylan's mannerisms. And there were a few moments that really gestured towards what Bob Dylan seemed to have been like at that time. Although crucially, I don't think he ever really nailed the interior world of Bob Dylan, but I think that that's more of a fault of the direction and the script rather than Timmy's acting ability or performance of Bob Dylan. Joan Baez, portrayed by Monica Barbaro, amazing. In my opinion, the best performance of the movie. She is quite mesmerizing, and she's obviously very beautiful and has a very enchanting presence when she's singing and when she's kind of glancing at Bob Dylan and interacting with other characters. She has a very magnetic presence in this movie, and I felt like she was the one that came closest to bringing some of Joan Baez's energy out in a unique way, where it didn't feel like she was trying to completely be Joan Baez, but rather take some of her essential energy and put it into this dramatic context. And I actually feel like she has some of the best moments in terms of performance and subtlety in the entire movie. I really wish that there was more of that, actually. For me, one of my favorite moments, probably my favorite moment in the whole movie, was seen towards the end when, I gotta look at my notes here. When she looks at Timothy Chalamet performing It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, the way that she looks at him during that moment, to me, carried more meaning and more nuance and abstraction and real poeticism and drama than more than half of this movie, which is very melodramatic, in my opinion. Elle Fanning does a great job with what she's given, although her character is truly very thin, and does Susie Rotolo's character. It really changes the way that Susie Rotolo was in real life, according to a lot of different accounts. And I felt like that was one of the most problematic parts of this movie, is how the relationship between Bob Dylan and Susie Rotolo is dramatized in this movie. It's just, well, I'll get into that a little later. But Elle Fanning does great with what she's given. Her ability to emote, it feels very genuine, even though it's in such a awful script. The second best performance in the whole movie was Edward Norton. He was the one that got closest to truly inhabiting Pete Seeger, to the point where I was actually a bit shocked when he first started speaking, and when he first showed up in the movie, I was like, that's Pete Seeger. Just the way that he enunciates, but also his physical gestures and mannerisms, it's so refined and detailed, and he really does also carry the energy of Pete Seeger. Although I don't think he transforms it very much. It's understandable because the script doesn't leave a lot of room for nuances, in my opinion. I feel like this is a very strangely structured script, and I really wonder what this movie really was trying to get at ultimately. Production design was pretty cool. It was nice to see Greenwich Village reconstructed. It was nice to see the setting of the Newport Folk Festival recreated. There's some atmosphere there, which was cool. To me, those are the positives, and unfortunately, that is about it. And I have a lot to say about the actual things that this movie changes or doesn't address in terms of Bob Dylan's personality and life and artistic progression during this time. But a lot of those things can be excused. For example, the timeline of this movie is quite scrambled, and the climax of the movie is mixing 2 or 3 years of Bob Dylan's career into like one night, basically. And that's understandable for the amount of time, the runtime, and the story that they were attempting to tell. So I don't have too many problems with that. The Woody Guthrie section in the beginning of the movie feels so immediate and abrupt, and Bob Dylan meeting Pete Seeger as well. Like, there isn't a lot of room to be with the character of Bob Dylan before he meets his absolute idol hero, Woody Guthrie, or one of his mentors, Pete Seeger, or if not mentor, then, someone who was very influential and helpful in his career at that time. And that's all understandable. The issues that I have with this movie are more about subtext, which there is almost none in this movie, choices of character work and portrayal, and the central character, the protagonist of the movie. It's funny that the movie is called The Complete Unknown, because he is kind of left as a complete unknown by the end of the movie. We don't really get to know Bob Dylan. It's a bit ridiculous. If that was the intention of the movie, I feel like they could have done it in a much more interesting way. If this movie really wanted to create a portrayal of a character that's very enigmatic, like the real Bob Dylan is, I feel like removing any human qualities or emotional qualities from the character is not really the way to go. I feel like creating more contrast and more nuances of who this guy is, and complicating our ability to understand all the sides to him would have been a more interesting approach. This movie seems to be more focused on wanting to make Bob Dylan seem like a cool guy, but also wanting to make him seem like an invincible, very arrogant, cocky artist that never fails, which I found really weak and kind of to the detriment of the storyline. There's never a point where Bob Dylan has a moment of vulnerability that we can really understand or be let into. There are a couple of emotional moments with Bob, but they feel either too shallow or unearned, or they're just confused in the sense of, well, why does this matter to this guy? We don't really know, because we don't spend enough time with the character of Bob Dylan to really understand, okay, well, does this matter to him? Like, why does it matter that people ask him about the songs and they're selfishly thinking that, oh, well, why didn't I get the song ideas that you got? If there is an element of isolation or feeling so all alone, where is that? There is none of that in this movie. If anything, he just seems arrogant and not caring for a lot of the runtime. Bob Dylan meets his hero, Woody Guthrie. He already has a cocky attitude, a kind of, yeah, I'm the best kind of attitude, which is so odd because at that point he's just a kid from Minnesota that just arrived in New York. And we don't really even get much of that until later on, where he's lying about his past and stuff. But we do see that he's someone that doesn't have a lot of money, that is sort of trying to find Woody Guthrie at the very start of the movie. But how is this supposed to make us feel for this character if he immediately meets the person that he says is his hero, and he is already kind of not very reverent to him, other than him saying that he feels a little bit nervous, but that he never really feels nervous usually. It's also too easy. There is no progression in his artistic development and his songwriting. He just meets Woody Guthrie and he already has the song for Woody written, which is okay. The timeline is all warped anyway. But he sings the song and Woody Guthrie is just in awe of him. So he immediately has the validation of the most influential person. And the movie does show him being kind of an asshole and being kind of mean to people throughout, but because there isn't enough contrast of showing kindness or his curiosity or sense of humor, there are a couple of very small moments, but ultimately, because it doesn't show enough of that side of him, he just seems like this very unlikable guy that writes these superb songs. But that's another thing. The songs, which are so timeless and so beautiful and have so much lyrical power to them, they're often used in this movie to basically, in my view, prop up the very shallow melodramatic setups that happen before and after the songs. And they change the context of the lyrics to be connected to those situations, which in my opinion is a total disservice to those songs that are so eternal and so beautiful and so universal in many cases. It's a real minimizing of the music and of the lyrics. And I heard a interview with James Mangold where he was saying that the songs are monologues about Bob Dylan in the movie, and I feel like that's equally reductive, especially because there isn't a lot of Bob Dylan that we get to see outside of the music. So we get these songs as if they were directly about Bob Dylan, when these songs explore so much more than his character. They show that he has this ability to write these songs that are incredible, but they go further than just that. They go into areas that talk about humanity and how people connect to one another, and about the times that everyone was living in, but also time itself, a timelessness to them. Something that I found interesting is that there's no real sense of like the magicalness that Bob Dylan seemed to have been so interested in progressively more and more throughout the 60s. His first couple of songs, he does mention kings and queens, and he already has this collapsing of all time in his songwriting right there from the beginning. And there's always a mystical or magical element that he's bringing in that recontextualizes the more modern references that he has in his music.
Group of protesters here, perhaps carrying cards with pictures of Jack of Diamonds on them and Ace of Spades on them.
And there's none of that in the movie. There's none of these elements of what is Bob Dylan interested in artistically.
I stayed at a lot of people's houses which had, poetry books and poetry volumes, and I read what I found, and I found Verlaine poems or Rimbaud.
What is he like other than Woody Guthrie? I mean, that seems to be Woody Guthrie and the blues, and that's kind of it. And he mentions that country music, and he likes Johnny Cash, but it's all very shallow, and it seems like the progression of the career takes more of a forefront, and then the movie tries to make up for not having much in terms of depth of that progression or reasoning or drama. So it tries to make up for that by creating this melodramatic love triangle. And these are observations that I'm trying to make just based on what's in the movie, outside of reading and study of Bob Dylan and admiration for his art. The songs that are in the movie, you can hear that in those lyrics there is so much there. There's so much there that is beyond what is actually shown in the movie. So if you were to listen to those songs, they are confined into this narrative that is kind of shallow and kind of honestly feels like a Netflix movie to me a lot of times. But then if you look at the actual source material that they had to work with, that's where this movie really becomes frustrating for someone that really likes Bob Dylan.
These are all protest songs now, come on. It's not British music, it's American music. Now, come on.
It's understandable that they couldn't make a movie that touches on everything. Obviously, that would be more like a miniseries. Still, the concessions that they make are pretty baffling and bizarre to me. I haven't read the book that this movie is directly based on, but I have read about this moment in Bob Dylan's life. I mean, there is so much about this time period in Bob Dylan's life, in pop culture and media. There's so much that has been explored. The Martin Scorsese documentary, I mean, it gets cited a lot. It gets written about a lot. In Behind the Shades, the Clinton Halen book, you get even more insight to accounts of what Bob Dylan was like in the early 60s into the mid 60s. And it's really, really fascinating. I mean, this was someone that had such a unique sense of humor and such a charisma, and also a really amazing understanding and appreciation for art that was pretty deep. And that's something that's also highlighted in Bob Dylan's own chronicles that he wrote about this period in time, where he talks about visual artists and he talks about so many different characters that were around in that scene that that influenced him and that made him think about life in a certain way, and those things are in the music. This movie doesn't really explore a lot of that. There's one scene that I really enjoyed in the movie where he plays with a blues musician on Pete Seeger's TV show, and there isn't much there that actually signals to why Bob is into the blues or his appreciation of that art form, but there is a little bit of personality that gets revealed there, and that hints at how he engages with the blues. To me, a moment like that should have been a huge part of this movie. It should have been how he interacts with different people, how his charisma comes out, how his humor comes out, how he focuses on certain things in terms of the music, in terms of the art and expression, what he is interested in, what is he trying to figure out musically or interpersonally, and how that affects the music that he was writing at that time. And another thing about the songs in this movie is that someone that has never heard Bob Dylan, to be hearing the songs played by Timothée Chalamet for the first time, it's unfortunate, because although Timothée Chalamet plays the songs well, proficiently, it's ultimately not capturing the real essence of what makes Bob Dylan so compelling, which is very mysterious for sure, but there are also qualities that are very, very refined and very detailed and really amazing that Timothée Chalamet just doesn't capture at all. In fact, one of the biggest issues that I have with Timothée Chalamet's performance of the songs themselves is that although he sounds sufficiently like Bob Dylan, it really sounds like he's impersonating him in a pretty good way, and he's honoring the kind of inflections to a certain extent. He is very rigid in that performance, in his actual playing of the guitar and his enunciations and way of singing the songs. It seems like he's more focused on creating an impression that, oh, this is Bob Dylan singing, rather than actually inhabiting the songs, which is something that Bob Dylan, in his own words, talks about a lot, especially about this time period. In Chronicles, he mentions that a lot of people wanted to project themselves out as they were playing the songs, rather than honoring the song itself. And that's something that Bob Dylan's performances throughout his early 60s records really radiated, this very unique quality that was very compelling.
I met a young woman whose body was burning. I met a young girl, she gave me a rainbow. I met one man who was wounded in love. I met another man who was wounded in hatred.
And something about this, the way that Bob Dylan actually played these early 60s songs can be found, some insight can be found on Clinton Haylin's book, where he mentions that the Woody Guthrie songbook, California to the New York Island, it has an introduction by Pete Seeger, where Pete Seeger sort of breaks down a little bit of Woody Guthrie's performance style, and just the folk song, where if you're going to perform folk music, or you're going to perform songs that have some of that spiritual quality to them, these are some guidelines that Pete Seeger puts forth. What any singer can learn from Woody's method of performance are such things as 1. A matter-of-fact, unmelodramatic understatement throughout. 2. Simplicity above all, and getting the words out clearly. They are the most important part of the song. And 3, which to me is the most important in terms of comparing the real songs to Timothée Chalamet's performances in this movie, irregularity. These are qualities that can be found in Bob Dylan's performance style and art throughout his entire career. I mean, shows from the Never Ending Tour to shows in the early 60s all have these qualities where, okay, maybe the lyrics aren't always the clearest. But this matter-of-fact, unmelodramatic, understated performance style and the use of irregularity are obviously clear, huge influences on Bob Dylan and how he chose to portray some of his songs. Some of his super poetic, incredible songs he would sing in a very unemotional way or a very casual way, but always with this sense of irregularity. this is something that the movie addresses kind of in Song for Woody. Timothy Chalamet elongates one word of the song a lot and draws it out and then concludes the song. And that's an example of something that Bob Dylan did a lot, but has always done. He's always messed with phrasing, and that's one of the things that he's so brilliant at doing. But also these unpredictable shifts in how he's performing a song. And that applies not only to his singing, but also his playing, especially during the early 60s when it was just his guitar and his voice. And the movie addresses that in that one song, but then and the other songs are all very regimented, and that gives a kind of stale quality. It feels like a real reduction of some of what made the real recordings and the real performances so interesting and so appealing. The movie is just trying to make this epic moment out of these songs because the songs are so good, but the context that they're in and how they're being played, they don't really reflect that. They feel like these diamonds that are placed in a movie that's extremely average, and so they get kind of, some of their shine gets dulled out from that, and also from the way that they're being played. They're very predictable and very rigid in how they're being performed, which is something that Bob Dylan has never really been like. I actually felt like Joan Baez, Monica Barbaro's performances of her songs had a lot more fluidity to them and had a bit more elasticity in the playing and the singing than the Timothy Chalamet performances, which in reality it's really the other way around, where Joan Baez has always had a very operatic, very rigid, formalist way of playing her songs, whereas Bob Dylan is always unpredictable. Yeah, it's quite frustrating because there are so many performances of Bob Dylan in the early 60s that are compelling because of how he's masterfully guiding your attention with the lyrics. He really knows his song well. It's almost cinematic to me. Even just as a listening experience, there is such a quality of acting, of inhabiting the songs that is so masterful and unique. And that's none of that is in the actual performances in this movie. And that leads to another, criticism of this script and the choices of this movie. Why would they have these classic songs recreated? I mean, they'll never be able to get a band that played with that much electricity as the original band. They'll never get Bob Dylan. They're never going to get someone that actually matches Bob Dylan's energy. So it kind of falls flat. And it's a choice that only seems to highlight maybe the actors that, oh, look, they can do this. And this movie really just feels like this kind of Oscar bait for Timothée Chalamet especially, but ultimately there isn't a lot of heart in this movie. And also there's a framing of what he was trying to do artistically, especially when he gets more into the electric stuff, that really feels very disingenuous to the spirit of Bob Dylan at that time. It just is odd to me, where he was really trying to stay true to an artistic vision that it can be understood historically, it can be understood contextually, but the movie seems to make it like he's more of just trying to be a rebel and he's just trying to say fuck you to everybody. That's not really honoring the character. It's not really giving us insight into, well, what is this process? Why this? Where he was expanding his songwriting to a more universal level that still had a lot of concerns for humanity and emotion and a lot of the things that the folk revival scene that he started out with had at that time. He was still engaging with a lot of those things, a lot of political things too, and social things, but he was expanding that to another level. We don't get an insight into Bob Dylan, like where he was coming from. Instead, we get one line where he says, "Have you heard the new record?" to Pete Seeger, and it's that's it. Like we don't like what about like what is Bob Dylan feeling? What does he care about? Like we don't really get much of that. It's all very uh, removed and detached in a way that isn't interesting. Also, that scene with Pete Seeger at the hotel room is just strange. It's just strange. The type of pleading that Pete Seeger is doing with Bob Dylan makes it seem like the world would be different if Bob Dylan had continued playing folk music. It's just bizarre. It's just very, very bizarre. I feel like there are so many choices in this movie that don't really add up and don't really make sense. But yeah, ultimately, the thing that most bothered me about this movie as a movie is the missed opportunity for creating a very compelling emotional narrative.
I fell into that atmosphere of everything Kerouac was saying about the world being completely mad, and the only people for him that were interesting were the mad people, the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live and mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn, all those mad ones, and I felt like I fit right into that bunch.
The movie seems to suggest that his romantic relationships especially were animating a lot of the songwriting and a lot of his career progression, but we don't really see, we kind of just see him being a selfish asshole, like in his relationships. There's no, like, where is the emotional component that's going on? I mean, when Susie Rotolo's character, fictionalized character, goes to Italy, that's just kind of something that happens, and then Bob Dylan, I believe in the timeline, that's when he gets with Joan Baez in the timeline of the movie. But in real life, that was a huge thing for Bob Dylan. That was very devastating to him, and he was really messed up from that. And that did lead to songs that are very, very powerful emotionally. It seems like the movie is like allergic to showing him vulnerable or showing him feeling anything or trying to work things out. He called the Van Ronks in the middle of the night at like 3 or 4 in the morning when Susie was in Italy, and he was just crying on the phone saying that he missed her. And that's where is that in this movie? Like, there's no moment like that where we actually, also in terms of conflict, like we don't get any conflict with Susie Rotolo's character and Bob Dylan's character. It's kind of flat. It's like he starts cheating on her, and then that's kind of it. And then there's like a little bit of tension there, but not really, like not in any great depth. It's very detached and strange. There's a real lack of exploration in terms of this person's first true love and first relationship, which had a very big impact in his life, clearly, like from all accounts. And it's and even from Bob Dylan himself. And in terms of his love life, Sarah Dillon is not in this movie. Sarah Lowndes. Like, how can this story be told and try to meaningfully portray his love life or his emotional depths at this time? A movie that's choosing to actively engage in that part of Bob Dylan and not have the mother of his children in this movie. It's just so bizarre. Also, this movie is very sanitized. Like, there's like no sex in this movie, and there's also no drug use, which is so strange for Bob Dylan's story. I mean, there's this disheveled and kind of grimy aspect to his personality that is just not present in this movie at all. I mean, it's amazing to me that they try to fuse like 3 years of his career into like 1 year, which is 64 to 66. 66 being the year where he was, he was on meth, and he was just on a lot of drugs at that time and not really doing great. And he was touring for a year and getting booed all over the world. And there's a toll there to that. And he was really fighting for his artistic vision during that time. None of that is explored. They just jump straight to his most aggressive and cynical traits towards the media. Very strange portrayal of what is very rich material. Bob Dylan is hilarious, and he displayed that humor a lot during this beginning of his career. It just feels like a real missed opportunity, and I think a lot of this has to do with James Mangold's direction. Wow, you had so much material to work with, and these were the things that you chose to highlight. Yeah, I would have loved to have seen a version of this movie that is just focused on Susie Rotolo's relationship with Bob Dylan, and then how he drifts away to Joan Baez, but that's not really what we get. It would have been really interesting to see how his relationship with his first love affects his artistic progression and his social life. That would have been really fascinating. And where does he, become a womanizer? Was that always a thing? Or how does he go away from her? And then only having the songs maybe at the end, or one or two songs that really amplify the depths of emotion that would be in that story. My favorite line in the movie is when Timothée Chalamet is in the elevator, and he says to play the songs, or how he comes up with those songs.
I put myself in another place, but I'm a stranger there.
But I'm a stranger there. And that's such a Bob Dylan line. It's just so Bob Dylan, but the execution is emblematic of the flaw that this movie is, the failure that this movie is in trying to capture his mystique and his magic. Timothée Chalamet doesn't understand that line in the way that he delivers it. He seems to be doing a Bob Dylan impression, but he doesn't seem to be connecting with what the actual meaning of that is. And I'm not saying I fully understand that line. It's a very mysterious and very Bob Dylan type of line. But when Bob Dylan says stuff like that, you can see that he knows what he's saying, or the place that he's coming from is at least extremely compelling. Just even to put words together in the way that he does is just is really mesmerizing and fascinating to think about. There's nothing that amplifies those moments where there's a little bit of Bob Dylan-ness coming through, at least in the dialogue, to really make you feel like that's Bob Dylan, or think about those things in a different way. Yeah, really, really, really disappointing, frustrating movie. The interesting things are just things that hint at what could have been, and it's just very disappointing. Yeah, I really wish I liked it. I really wanted to love this movie. I really wanted to enjoy this movie more than I did. But yeah, I have a hard time recommending it. But if you just want to hear Bob Dylan music in a theater, I guess that's worth a watch. But if you know Bob Dylan's story, you might feel a bit disappointed. Also, just in terms of that, I've wanted to see a portrayal of Bob Dylan meeting Woody Guthrie in a movie for years. When reading Behind the Shades, I really was imagining how that must have been like. Just, it's so interesting to think about. But so that was cool to see in a movie. It was cool to see some of these scenes that I've read about in the past made into a dramatic form. But ultimately, it's just very uninteresting and it doesn't carry that much depth. Anyway,